The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brooks Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brooks Show on this Thursday, last day of February, leap year. I'm excited. We're going to talk to a real expert on the show today. And we're going to talk to Dr. Eric Forman. Dr. Forman is the medical and laboratory director at Columbia University Fertility Center. He oversees the medical practice as well as IVF, embryology, and andrology laboratories. I won't read the whole bio. It's a long bio. It's in the description. But Eric, thank you. Really appreciate you coming today.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to talking to you and your audience about IVF and the implications of what's going on in Alabama and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think that what the right is doing, the approach to abortion, how they've treated women whose health is risked by pregnancy in places like Texas, and now this new ruling in Alabama, a state that pretty much denies abortion other than in extreme medical conditions from pretty much all cases. I think that this is a massive attack on rights, and so. But I thought we'd kind of dig into the IVF question because I think it's a really good concrete, and it's such a good concrete that even Republicans are kind of shaken up by it, and they're kind of saying, "Oh no, we didn't mean to do this," and they're trying to fix it. And in Alabama, it looks like they're passing a law to try to fix what they've done, but the implications are going to be. I don't think this is the end of it, right? Even if they do pass a law, because there are real implications. So why don't we start with really the positives here? Because one of the things that I think is interesting about all of this is IVF's really exciting and kind of cool, and the whole field of fertility medicine is a lot of innovation. And so I just want us to, maybe if you could describe what it is in more detail than maybe we typically get.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I also have been fascinated by this field for more than 20 years, and why I decided to devote my life to it and help people preserve their fertility and achieve, having children if they wouldn't have been able to otherwise, and also have healthy children, which I'll talk about, can be affected by this ruling. So IVF is actually not an old technology. The first IVF baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1978, just a few months younger than me in the UK. And there's been, as you said, a lot of innovation over the last few decades. But really the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen major improvements in the efficiency and safety of this process. Basically, IVF involves getting eggs and fertilizing them outside the body. In vitro means in glass. Not really in glass, we use plastic dishes, but basically rather than in utero or in vivo. So in vivo, a woman naturally, first of all, women are born with all their eggs, although that's been challenged. But basically, we think women are born with all their eggs. They're in these things called follicles. They gradually use them up as they get older. And women who ovulate release one egg each month. And if they get pregnant naturally, sperm has to travel through the reproductive tract, find that egg. Hopefully, it's a good egg, good sperm, travel into the uterus, implant, and make a baby. But that doesn't happen for a lot of couples who are even healthy and trying sometimes for years. There could be damage or blockage of the fallopian tubes. There could be low sperm numbers. As women get older, this finite number of eggs they're born with, the quality, the genetic status of those eggs changes so that it gets much more difficult to achieve a healthy pregnancy as women reach late 30s and early 40s. And by mid 40s, it gets virtually close to impossible. And that's something that is not that well known out there, but it really changes a lot. So we can overcome this by using hormones to stimulate multiple follicles to grow rather than one. We can retrieve the eggs so that we have them in the lab. We can get sperm either from a partner or a donor. We can combine eggs and sperm together to make embryos. And that's the question, are those people or are those just taking eggs, which are type of cells, sperm, which are a type of cells, and come together and make a new cell, an embryo or zygote that then divides in the lab. And this is where the changes have happened. We've gotten much better at culturing embryos, freezing and thawing embryos, genetically testing embryos, so that most of the time now we actually put, I mean, I think when people hear, in your audience hear about IVF, you think about triplets and octomom. Now, most of the time we're putting one embryo at a time, and we know that that embryo is actually genetically normal for chromosomes. We can't test every single gene. This isn't like designer babies or anything, but pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidies, what's called PGTA. Basically, we can take a biopsy of a few cells from a ball of cells called a blastocyst, determine if it has the correct number of chromosomes, and then in a subsequent month, or it could be years later, thaw this normal embryo and place it in a woman's uterus. So that's basically IVF as we currently practice it, which is still far from perfect. And sometimes we're not able to produce, any viable embryos. A significant proportion of even the embryos that look normal and test normal don't implant and don't develop into babies. So it's gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot safer. We're seeing a lot fewer high-risk multiple pregnancies. We've changed the way we stimulate and do the process so that women can recover and not put their own health at risk. So it's gotten a lot better. I'm happy to clarify any aspect of that, but that's the basics of IVF in a nutshell.
So, when you implant the embryo in the woman, how many times, in a sense, of the cells multiply? That is, how big is the zygote? What is it? What does it look like? What are its kind of characteristics?
So initially, again, when sperm and egg come together and make a single cell, the day after the egg retrieval is the procedure where we retrieve or harvest the eggs. It's one cell, but we can tell that it's fertilized because there are these pronuclei from the male and female contribution. Then it divides and divides. 3 days after the egg retrieval, that used to be a common time to place embryos back, they may have 6 or 7 or 8 individual cells. So that is an embryo, and it's just, again, individual cells. Those cells, again, you can't tell whether it's going to become a heart or a brain, or it's still, as we say, like pluripotent. It could become anything. Over the big advance over the last, say, 20 years, as we've gotten better at what's called extended culture to grow embryos to the blastocyst stage, and many of them stop growing. They're just not good enough quality. They're not normal. But by 5 or 6 days after we've taken the eggs out, some will become what's called a blastocyst, which is a ball of cells less than 1 millimeter in diameter, roughly 100 to 200 little, smaller cells, so that the egg is actually the biggest cell in the human body. The sperm is the smallest cell, just basically DNA with very little cytoplasm. They come together, make this now zygote, and then that divides into smaller and smaller cells that by 5 or 6 days is this ball of cells with a part that we can tell could become the fetus, the baby, the outer part that becomes a placenta. That's what we biopsy. So this embryo is, visible under low magnification. It's not so tiny, but not so obvious to the naked eye. It's loaded in a soft catheter placed through the cervix into the uterus with ultrasound guidance. It's common to call it implanted or transplanted. We use the term transferred or replaced because we actually don't embed it. We just place it in the uterus as gently as possible. And 9 or 10 days later, in blood work, we can tell if there's HCG, which is the pregnancy hormone, and we follow that and see if a pregnancy ensues.
Wow.
So that's how it works.
That's
And
really
it's
cool.
pretty amazing.
Yeah. But one thing that strikes me is we're talking about something that can barely see with the naked eye. You're talking about 100 cells, maybe, or earlier 6 or 7 individual cells.
Right.
So what is it? What does it even mean to call this a baby or a human being? And as the anti-abortionists are calling it, um, it seems so removed from kind of just a perceptual experience. Never mind our understanding.
Yeah. I mean, and the I'd say like the majority, depending on age, of embryos that are made do not have the ability to, even in the ideal environment, which they're not in the lab, don't have the ability to implant. I mean, we struggle with patients who've done multiple cycles of IVF, have transferred multiple embryos. And so it's far from a guarantee, even if placed in the right environment. But outside that environment, they're, again, individual cells dividing with potential, but does not look like, this is, again, not to justify in any way, but in the abortion debate, you see a fetus a certain number of weeks, and there are features that you could imagine look like could become a baby, and if left alone, that pregnancy would likely progress. So it is an active step, which again is often necessary to end an unhealthy pregnancy or save, improve a woman's health, or she just, again, it's not the right time for her to have a child. So that's her right. But that is an active step, whether it's medicated or a procedure. Here, we have to actively place this embryo into the uterus and hope that it finds a place to implant and continues to develop. Left on its own, it would just, die out after a week or two at most. So that's the other thing that, again, is kind of confusing to me, that we're not, when we discard these embryos, where, they're in their environment where they were made, and they can't continue without being in the right place actively from someone who wants that embryo there and wants it to be a baby.
So maybe talk us through the Alabama court decision and kind of what it implies for IVF. I mean, it seemed almost like people were surprised, and the court was surprised, and others were surprised, that the implication of the ruling was that now IVF clinics were shutting down or stopping the procedure.
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer or an expert in like these political matters, but I will say, like, I was surprised, and in our field, we've been reassured or told ourselves that they would not go after IVF because this is the most pro-life thing. We're helping make babies, people who want babies desperately, more than anything. We're giving them an opportunity. And my wife has been telling me for years, like, this is, as you've been saying, like, IVF, contraception, it's not that far-fetched. And she was right. Even though I don't think, and I hope this isn't going to impact the practice of IVF in New York, where I practice, or most states, or even hopefully Alabama, it does show, a view that is very different than our view of assisted reproduction. And if this view became more prevalent, would limit the ability of us to help people who really want to have children have those children. And so my understanding of it is that there was a situation, and I don't know all the details, where somebody we have these frozen embryos, as I mentioned. It's become pretty standard to actually freeze all the embryos from a cycle. It used to be we weren't as good at culturing and freezing, and that actually may, the way IVF used to be practiced, I think, again, was not as safe and ideal, but multiple embryos would be put back a few days after the egg retrieval, and their early stage success rates were lower. Sometimes triplets, quadruplets would happen. which would be very risky for those future children. They could be lost, the mom. So we've gotten much better. It's safer to let the woman recover, her hormones go back to normal, and select embryos to thaw one at a time. So this clinic apparently, has these tanks with liquid nitrogen where these embryos are submerged. And that's also amazing that they can stay, basically unchanged for years. And you
Stunning.
can take them out, place them in the right culture media environment, and they'll wake up and start dividing again, looking basically the same as they did months or years before. But
How long has that been a process of this idea of freezing embryos and being successful at freezing?
Pretty early on in IVF, even since the early 1980s. I think the first baby from frozen embryo might have been from Australia in the early 80s. But really there still was not a perfect process, and we would lose 20% or so of embryos in that process. So there was still an incentive to put them back fresh.
Sure.
But about 15 years ago, a technique called vitrification, which is an ultra rapid method of freezing them before ice crystals can form, was developed, and we see much higher survival after warming or thawing. Something like 98, 99% of the embryos survive and look just as good as they did when we froze them. But sometimes one just doesn't come through, and that's something we could talk about, why we make more embryos when we can, if we really want this to work. But in this particular case, it seems like someone, I think maybe unauthorized, somehow got access to a tank, took out what we call a cane, maybe got burned by the liquid nitrogen, dropped it, and those embryos, again, were not, in the right temperature, and basically were no longer viable, which is a tragedy. This is terrible. There were other situations that got a lot of attention in the media a few years ago where there was a tank failure in a clinic, and embryos were lost. And this is, I'm a lab director. This keeps me up at night that we have these tanks, dozens of tanks with eggs and sperm and embryos, and we take this seriously because it's, it is a couple or individuals, hope for future possibility of pregnancy and parenthood.
And that's the real tragedy.
The
tragedy is to the people who donated the egg and the sperm. The tragedy that their plans are now thwarted, that they won't be able to follow through.
Right. So that, that is a sad situation. But then again, my understanding is that then some of the couples sued or claiming, wrongful death of like a child, basically.
Okay.
So from, this accident, or again, I don't accident or intentional, I'm not sure, but basically the judge ruled that those embryos, are children, and that a clinic or a doctor could be held, accountable for the death of a child or children in this process, which again, we would be viewed as loss of valuable, property that, could potentially be used to hopefully achieve a couple's dreams, but not actual children.
Yeah.
So that that concern, because in the process, as I mentioned, as we're culturing embryos, some of them stop developing. So does that mean we made embryos and we, caused them to die or kill? Could we be held liable? Embryologists move around the lab carrying dishes and moving embryos from one media to another. And they're amazing and almost never make a mistake, but we're humans and things happen. So if something happened, are they at risk of, again, death of a child? So the clinics in Alabama, until this was clarified, basically stopped practicing IVF, which was really sad for, again, those couples that really want and need this technology to have their children. So that, again, if, if each embryo is viewed the same as a child, I mean, that would have dramatic implications on our ability to practice IVF and advance this technology and help people in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, this is I'm looking here at the story in the Washington Post. It's got a citation from State Representative Ernie Yarbrough, who's a Republican, and he has this to say: it is not possible to do IVF in a pro-life way that treats embryos as children, which they are. He then goes on to call the destruction of embryos, part of IVF, a silent holocaust going on in our state.
That is one view. Again, another view is that, without IVF, couples who want to have children would not be able to. There's some couples that, again, if a woman's fallopian tubes have been damaged, she's had ectopic pregnancies, men who have very low sperm counts, sometimes there's blockage. There's certain situations where there's just essentially no possibility of having children. And then there's also situations where couples would be at risk of having very sick children, even children dying. And again, I think this view, was it a state senator, would view that as preferable. So I mentioned briefly pre-implantation genetic testing. We do IVF even for people without infertility. We have patients who have a child who has some rare genetic disease and dies, and they don't want to risk that happening again or terminating a pregnancy. So actually preventing abortion by making embryos. And we work with genetics laboratories to develop probes to be able to target when we get this DNA from these few cells we biopsy. We amplify that DNA and can determine whether the embryo inherited a mutation and is a carrier like its parents or two copies and would have this disease. And then we thaw an embryo that wouldn't have the disease. But again, if you view each embryo as a person or baby, they could argue that even those embryos that would be destined to have lethal genetic condition should be given a chance. It's not clear like how that would happen. Like, could you keep these embryos frozen in perpetuity, and then who is responsible for that? Because there's cost to storing them in space, and is it the couple who people pay storage fees, but then when their family is complete, they've achieved their goals, they no longer keep them stored. Some people donate them to other couples, and that's their choice. But most people view this technology again as a way to help people have as many hopefully healthy children as they want, hopefully one at a time. And when that's complete, you can discard your embryos and move on with your actual children.
And so, I mean, a ruling like this would suggest that those embryos would have to be kept for perpetuity, not just any ones that were not used, because, some couples might decide ultimately not to have children and the embryos are there and they're never going to be used.
It's also couples could divorce, and there's been cases where one person wants to use the embryos and the other doesn't. And most clinics, like, we would not thaw and transfer such an embryo. We don't think we should make someone a parent that doesn't consent to that. Mm-hmm. But again, if you view it as a child already, then, either party could theoretically have a right to it and make someone a parent who doesn't consent, doesn't want to have a child with that person anymore. Could be someone abusive, Again, there's all kinds of reasons why. And so that's another scary, potential implication. So it's not clear like what would happen to these extra embryos, who would be responsible. And that's part of why it could shut things down. an alternative, which I've heard like Ben Shapiro talking on this topic, sounds simple, but basically said you should only fertilize as many embryos as you would want to put back, but that would actually be disastrous for this field. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about like what
Yeah,
that would
walk us through
either
why it would be disastrous.
So first of all, again, even with the best technology and the best labs, like more than half of the IVF cycles, even fertilizing all the eggs and making the embryos and transferring them and genetically testing, we still struggle. And there's a lot of people who have to do this multiple times, and it's hard to predict. Some people do really well and their embryos develop beautifully and there's more than they need. And then others, for reasons we can't predict, there's quality issues and you don't know that up front. So the only way to practice this way would be to, fertilize or a limited number, which could be one. I mean, if it was one at a time, again, we've gotten better at freezing eggs. So theoretically, you could fertilize one egg, make an embryo, transfer to a woman where it might not develop. And if she doesn't get pregnant, thaw another egg, fertilize it, make another embryo, or make more. And that would be so inefficient that, again, people would be incentivized to put multiple embryos back. And so we'd go back to higher risk twin, triplet pregnancies. Also, this resource, we already struggle in certain areas to have enough doctors and embryologists to perform these services. So if each treatment to achieve a baby involved that many more steps, I mean, there's things that may be automated in the future, but it would either, again, involve so much more work that we just couldn't accommodate, the demand. And I mean, it would become a lot more expensive. There'd be fewer babies. And that doesn't, again, and then in that view, genetic testing of embryos probably would not be an option. So, again, there would be more babies being born with genetic diseases or terminated, if it was in a state where that was legal. But I mean, these things go together. But
so there's no point in doing genetic testing because you're not allowed to, according to this ruling, you wouldn't be allowed to discard the ones that had a negative genetic outcome because they're still babies theoretically.
Correct. Again, according to that interpretation.
Yeah.
So
yeah, good.
No, I think again, that would be a very like anti-life approach. There would be fewer babies. Right now, roughly 100,000 babies a year are born through IVF, approximately 2% in the US. Many more worldwide. There's been estimates of 8 or more million babies born through IVF worldwide. 2% of babies born in the US are through IVF. And I think that's part of why this, again, has maybe, gotten this kind of attention. I think everyone knows someone who had children through IVF and that those children are normal and healthy and, again, would not exist without this technology.
So, you told me before the show that Ben Shapiro had commented on this. I hadn't heard that. So tell us a little bit about what Ben Shapiro said and his attitude and where do you think that attitude actually comes from?
Yeah, he basically, again, I listened to a segment. He basically said that, life begins at conception or fertilization, that location doesn't matter, that the sort of pro-choice or pro-reproductive rights view is it's all about location. And to him, it's a life wherever the location. It's a life if it's sitting in a dish or frozen in a tank or in a woman's uterus or, again, born is actual life. And that so destruction of, any life is is wrong, and that he's not against IVF, but he thinks it could be done more responsibly, like I said, and by only making as many embryos as you would use, which again, I think it sounds to some like that sounds good, maybe, okay, but again, the outcome of that would be fewer successful treatments, the inability to provide this service to as many people as really benefit, and time matters. So if you have a wait list of a year or two, I mean that could be the difference of having a successful treatment or not. So even months matter. So if it takes that long to thaw out these eggs and make embryos and find out if it worked, again, some couples who would have had success and would have had a healthy child will not be able to. And if they try later when it's their turn again, they'll be older, and there just won't, again, at the way it's currently practiced, there's just not the resources to do IVF that way and produce as many successes as we are able to now. And he didn't really comment on genetic testing, but again, I think his view would be that is like eugenics and should not be done. And where the view is coming from, again, it's more of a Christian or even Catholic, I think, type of view. So the Pope has ruled against IVF, from the beginning of IVF, that, I mean, they're consistent on that they view it as a life and that have never approved of it. Ben Shapiro's Orthodox Jewish, the Jewish faith is very pro-children. It's very important to have children, have many children. And so most rabbis are very supportive of IVF. Israel has very high utilization and supports using IVF to have even 2 children. And even, again, abortion can be permitted in certain situations. So,
yeah, I mean, from my memory, there was never any. I mean, Israel never had an issue like the U.S. does around abortion, and the religious in Israel never made it a big deal. And as you said, IVF is very, very popular, common. Almost every Israeli. There are lots of clinics in Israel, and there are lots of specialists in Israel who do this.
The life of the mother is always like even like psychological impact, of having an unhealthy child. It's the mother's life is the most important in my understanding of the religion, and abortion can be approved, if that would be in jeopardy, but also at a very early stage, like the first, I think, 35 days or something, it's not even considered like truly a life, even in that like location of being in the uterus and growing. So there's really like not even any, I think, like need for a rabbi's approval that early, in my understanding, but I'm not an expert on that.
Yeah. So the good news is that it looks like Alabama is passing a law, that the legislature is passing a law that says that you won't be able to hold doctors and lab officials or technicians responsible legally for the death or damage to an embryo. But it seems to contradict the Supreme Court's claim that embryos are human beings. If embryos are human beings, then how can you not hold them responsible, right? I mean, it seems like there's a contradiction there. So it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out and how it's interpreted.
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully that will allow clinics to feel comfortable that their day-to-day processes are not, being viewed as potentially murder. So I hope that they'll be able to reopen and offer this technology, but if it's still like being held legally that the embryos are children, that still, again, puts doctors and embryologists, in a difficult position that, this can change, or again, what do we do with excess embryos is it acceptable to test and select against embryos that would have diseases? It's not so clear like what the implications would be.
Yeah. What could you describe a little bit about where you think the field is heading? Like, I mean, must be a super exciting field. The whole area of genetic testing is ramping up dramatically, and I'm sure the technology that you guys, I mean, can you project into the future and kind of where this is going, and IVF and other potential fertility treatments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first, I think there's still a long way to go to improve. As I said earlier, we still, unfortunately, don't succeed, and we have other options, that at a certain point when we're in the 40s age group, it gets very difficult to find eggs that even with producing multiple of them. But we have technologies like donor eggs, or women donate their eggs at a younger age, and that's again ethically complicated. There's carriers, like women carry pregnancies for women who may be at risk medically, or has her uterus removed surgically. I mean, so there's different ways that we can help people achieve, their goal of having children. But genetic testing, which we've talked about a little bit, and I think is really underused. There's still babies born with rare genetic diseases that we have the ability to, test and determine that couples would be at risk. And so, I mean, it's gotten more and more used, but testing people before they decide to have children and see if they're at risk of having a child rather than waiting until they're pregnant or until they have a sick child. So applying pre-implantation genetic testing for specific diseases, definitely there's room to improve there. I mean, it's interesting. I've only been like out of training for a little bit more than 10 years, but there's certain conditions that are also ethically controversial, like adult onset conditions. BRCA1 or 2 is a breast cancer gene. So we have patients that are healthy and, successful, but they're at much higher risk of developing breast or ovarian cancer. They have to go through lots of screening and anxiety and risk-reducing surgery. So that's again, interesting ethical, conversation. Should they do IVF to make embryos, even though one that has BRCA could be healthy, but could be a healthy child, but would have this risk. And not everyone does. And again, they have the right where it's, legal and permitted. And I think it's an interesting conversation. But, 10 years ago, I would say to these patients, we don't know in 20, 30 years when your daughter is ready to have children, we may have gene therapies that can fix that gene. So, maybe you don't have to do this. On the other hand, now I say, if you don't use this technology, it might be illegal for your daughter to use this technology. So if you want to get this gene out of your family, it may be better to do this now while you still can. So, and that's just in 10 years. And I used to kind of say it, jokingly, but now seriously. And, in states where abortion is not legal, I know you discussed the case in Texas, but, getting pregnant, even if you don't have infertility, getting pregnant, even for a fertile couple in their early 40s, again, we know people have been delaying, when they start their families as it's a trend, globally. So we see couples that are having children, at a more advanced age, still young and healthy, but 41, 42, is considered for a reproductive standpoint, an advanced age. And so if you're 41 and fertile in Texas and you get pregnant and there's, maybe a 2% risk that there could be a chromosome abnormality, and if that happens, you have to carry that baby, and maybe you've had 2 prior C-sections, you have to have a third C-section. And that's risky. And if you want another child, that's even more risky. Or go out of state, and that's not feasible for everybody. So using IVF to select an embryo that wouldn't be at risk of one of those age-related changes, and that's a trend we're seeing more of. In terms of like almost science fiction, again, I don't know that this is going to be in our time or going to be legal, but there are people who have like written about making new eggs or making embryos. So we don't select for really traits. I mean, people have looked at that, but I'm just talking about the basics, like correct number of chromosomes, not having a disease that will make a baby die. But theoretically, in the future, again, and whether this is a good or not thing, something that's interesting, could we take skin cells and turn them into eggs and make lots of embryos and test them? And would we have, the bioinformatic ability to know which is the healthiest or smartest or whatever? Again, we're a long way from that, and questionable whether it will be permitted, but that's something that's been, discussed. But the idea of making germ cells, like there are individuals who don't have eggs or who don't have sperm, could we take other types of cells and make sperm so that someone could have a child that's genetically linked to them? That's an area of active research. So there's a lot of interesting areas this field could go, but even I'd say just like the basics of what we're doing now, like there's still a lot of babies born with rare genetic diseases and couples who are struggling to have a child, even with the best technology and the best labs in the United States. And so I worry about anything that restricts that and makes it more difficult for us to practice. And again, I view like our role to help a woman or couple have as many children as they want to, again, one at a time, safely. And when they're, and again, like I said, sometimes in the process, there's more embryos made. They do really well and they make 5 embryos, and the first 2 make 2 healthy children. And that's a success. They have 2 healthy children, their family is complete, and they didn't need those other embryos. And again, there's other couples that have to go through 3 or 4 rounds of this just to get 1 embryo to take.
Sure.
And again, we're not great at predicting who that's going to be, other than age and number of eggs. So again, if you care about life and reproductive, rights, ability to have healthy children, you should, again, be concerned about giving rights to pre-implantation embryos, in the lab, and not actually children yet.
So you mentioned surrogacy as one of the fertility methods, I guess, that people are using, and I've noticed just recently that there seem to be in the press, there seem to be people attacking surrogacy, the morality of it, and challenging the legality of it. Have you seen that, and where's that really coming from?
Yeah, so surrogacy laws really vary state by state. I mean, that's almost what we're starting to see with abortion or maybe IVF, that even in New York, where I practice, it was not legal it was one of the few states until just, I think, 2020, just a few years ago, it was not legal to compensate a surrogate or carrier. Where, again, there are couples, there's women who have congenital heart condition that they get pregnant, they have a very high risk of dying, or they have a child and they have a hemorrhage and they have to have a hysterectomy. They don't have a uterus, but they have embryos. They want to give those embryos a chance at a life, and someone is willing to, help them, and they get typically compensated in the process. Sometimes it's a friend or family member, but most people don't have someone willing to do that.
Sure.
And usually there are women that are screened. We screen their health and psychological, history and pregnancy history. So they've had uncomplicated, low risk and pregnancies. But pregnancy is, as you've talked about, it is risky. So it's not something to be taken lightly. Even a healthy woman who's had a healthy pregnancy is taking risks to carry a pregnancy and deliver. But there are women that are willing to do that. And so that is how gestational carrier or surrogacy works. And then there's typically contracts as reproductive lawyers who will make contracts, and different states have different rules on when the baby's born, who's on the birth certificate, whether adoption has to occur. But there's clear, contracts that the parents who produced the egg and sperm that made the embryo, it's their baby, after the baby's born. I've also seen attacks on this from both sides, on the right, saying this is sort of renting a womb, or again, like making, babies, again, similar to how, again, we're making these babies in a lab, and that the mother, the woman carrying the pregnancy is the mother who carries and delivers. And again, that person plays an important role, but the parents who, are going to raise that child are the parents. But I've also seen on the left attacks from the feminist side that it's sort of, abusing, or, I don't know how to articulate it as well as they do, but I think that in New York, it was both sides. There was a religious argument against it, and there was a feminist argument against it, that it's exploiting women, basically. Although, again, they're doing this from their own free will and choosing how to use their body. So it's kind of interesting that this, some of the same group that is very pro abortion rights, that you have a right to your own body to end a pregnancy, felt like it's exploiting for a woman to choose to use her body to help another couple have a child. So it is an interesting, controversial area in our field.
How worried are you about politicians from both left and right kind of wanting to regulate not just the kind of healthcare as a business, but healthcare as a science, healthcare as a process? You mentioned in 10 years, these gene therapies might not be legal. How worried are you about the politicization of the science of medicine?
Yeah, I'm generally like an optimistic person, and I'm busy. We have a busy clinic, and I'm working hard to try to help patients have babies and work with our team of doctors and amazing lab staff and nurses. And so that occupies most of my energy. And I just have to believe that like the benefits of this, are so obvious and have touched so many people, that I hope nothing will be done to restrict it. But I am concerned, that one judge, could have this rule that a lot of people, even like Nikki Haley, people have said like, oh yes, I agree, it's a baby, and that has huge implications. And again, I think I'm worried about politicians that don't really understand the intricacies and implications. We saw that with abortion rules, that there's question of if it's an ectopic pregnancy that, could put a woman's life at risk, and can't, continue to term, is the doctor allowed to end that pregnancy? And that, worrying about technicalities of the law shouldn't interfere with doctor-patient relationship. And I worry that politicians thinking, again, they know more than they do, or sometimes just the words, even like the terminology. If you start reading, if you're in these fields and you read the language and the bills, it again doesn't make sense and doesn't reflect like medicine the way it's practiced, and could be interpreted again to say that you can't save a woman's life. You should let her, bleed to death internally from an ectopic pregnancy. Like that's scary. And again, I think eventually, like hopefully those things will be sorted out, but along the way, some people will suffer and die or not have children or not have access to amazing treatments, that could be available. So I am concerned that, if you say it's okay to limit what a woman can do with her body, that could be taken to limit any area of medicine that
Yep.
someone views as, not, plastic surgery, anything. Like why someone could some group could say like you shouldn't be allowed to do that. Like why should you change the way God made you? I don't know. But so I think
Yep.
again, it's best left between patients and doctors and experts, in these subject areas, and we've had amazing progress, when it's done that way. And so I think everyone who's like listening to again will hopefully be inspired to, even if you're beyond having children or not having children, that this is an important topic. What is life? Where do rights begin?
Absolutely. So we've got a couple of questions. Let me just say to the audience, if you have any questions, the super chat is available. So feel free to ask questions about IVF, about abortion, about anything regarding fertility, anything you think that Dr. Forman might have something to add. So I like Cloud has a question about, could you discuss why there seems to be a lack of male contraceptive options compared to female contraceptive options?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, hmm. Some, have, I think to interfere with ovulation, as that development of the birth control pill was an amazing advance in our field. I know you spoke about it recently.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the woman is the one that again ultimately is like where the pregnancy happens. So like having control over preventing pregnancy, I think is more reliable. When a male who's fertile ejaculates, there's hundreds of millions of sperm, and again a woman would have to be trusting that the partner is compliant. She still may want to protect herself. There have been options that have looked at to hormonally like suppress sperm production, but have not taken on, again, in the market. Why that is, it's hard to say. I think they may have more side effects. It may take longer to reverse. So when a woman stops taking hormonal contraception, typically she'll resume ovulating very quickly. But if you suppress sperm production, it takes months to make new sperm. So that's another factor, but it's an interesting question. I haven't thought about, in depth.
It does sound, I mean, what you said about the woman probably wanting to maintain control, given that she is the one who bears the direct consequence of pregnancy, makes a lot of sense. So that even if you had male contraception out there, women would probably want to take it. Although with married couples, where the trust is high, maybe that becomes less of an issue. But certainly unmarried women, you'd think, would want to take contraception no matter what.
But surgical sterilization, like vasectomy, is quite, highly utilized in this country, probably more so now than
Hmm.
tubal sterilization, which is more invasive. So
Yeah.
I think it's, when a married couple has their children, it's not uncommon for the guy to say he'll have a vasectomy. But for like reversible contraception, there's not really options on the male side.
No, no, it is interesting. I wonder how much of this is related to discrimination against women and a willingness to play around with female hormones and less to play around with male hormones. I don't know.
It could be some of that. Mm-hmm.
Kind of all right. I think this is our last question. If you guys have any more questions, now's the time, guys. Could you describe, Apollo Zeus wants to know, could you describe, I don't know what this is, andrology?
So andrology is more the like male side of reproduction. So the andrology lab deals with things sperm related. So we do semen analysis where we assess like the concentration, motility, shape of sperm, um, process sperm samples for, we don't always do in vitro fertilization. There's other fertility treatments like intrauterine insemination where sperm are placed in a woman's uterus. So women who are single or same-sex couples can use, or their male partner doesn't have sperm, can get sperm donated by a sperm bank, and they don't necessarily need to make use of this IVF technology. They can place, washed, thawed sperm in the uterus. So andrology is kind of the study of male reproduction. But something I also didn't mention, I guess another interesting, advance in this field is for people who get diagnosed with cancer or some medical condition, freezing sperm, freezing eggs, freezing embryo. So that's, we sometimes have a married couple and, a woman could get diagnosed with cancer and they want to make embryos because she's going to be exposed to chemotherapy that will damage her ovaries, or she may have to wait years before she's hopefully cured and can then be pregnant. So in this type of scenario, again, could we make those embryos, like if you're only, like Ben Shapiro says, fertilizing as many as you would use, is she like committed to use all of those in the future? Like we want to make as many as we safely can because we just don't know how they're going to do years in the future.
I'm curious about the genetic screening. You mentioned the breast cancer gene, which is an obvious one, but is there any thought about things like we now know, for example, that there are genes that make it much more likely to get Alzheimer's, ApoE4, I think, and genes that relate to other cancers. Are there any thoughts to screening for those as well in the future, or is it even being done today? I mean, Alzheimer's is becoming such a big deal.
Yeah, so I mean, there's anything that we know, what the location is, what the mutation is, we can theoretically test embryos for it. But it's mostly get used and still underused, even for conditions where we know, like sickle cell, there's one base pair change, and it changes, the function of red blood cells, and that's clear cut. So when there's this whole controversial area in our field called polygenic risk scores, like can we take, other markers and predict if embryos are going to be more likely to develop diabetes or heart disease or Alzheimer's. So I don't think it's like clear cut enough that, that again, even the BRCA1 gene, it's not a guarantee that you'll have breast cancer, but it may be a 60% lifetime risk. So I think, with later onset condition, it's just the oldest person born through IVF is 45 years old. So it's not really, and I'm not aware of it being used yet, but again, and it's still, even though it's amazing and gotten safer, it's still invasive. It's still taking medications, going through a procedure. It's fairly expensive, although I think well worth, the cost, but there doesn't seem to be a demand to prevent like diseases that have onset later.
Okay.
Although things like Huntington's disease,
Yeah.
that there is, and that's a whole another interesting area where there's people who know that their parent had Huntington's and they don't want to know whether they have it, but they want to ensure that their children don't have it. So
Yeah.
we actually do things like that where we will do IVF and test and make sure that an embryo wouldn't develop into someone that would get Huntington's without even telling the patient because they don't want to know or be biased one way or another. So
Wow.
it's called
Interesting.
non-disclosure PGT.
Interesting. Yeah. And that's only going to get, I mean, stuff like that, there's going to be only more of that as we understand the
Yeah.
genome better and understand the relationship between it and disease.
So again, anything again that is genetically, linked and there's a clear relationship we could potentially test for. People often ask about autism, but that's just not one gene or well understood. So we don't test for autism. We can't reduce that risk. But if in the future, there are, some genes or changes, variants that are associated with it, there's potential to test for anything. So yeah, I think that, in the future, testing for more things, preventing diseases, is definitely an area where this field is going, if allowed to.
All right. So Paulo Zeus has a couple of more questions. I don't know if this is your area, but he asks if long-term anabolic steroid use, if you know whether it causes damage to sperm production in males.
Yes, it does. So basically, when you take testosterone, it kind of tricks a male's brain into thinking there's testosterone around, and so it doesn't tell the testes to make testosterone. And to have sperm produced, it's not just testosterone circulating in the blood. You can measure blood level and it's high, but locally where the sperm are being made, it's actually low. And so it can actually cause what's called azoospermia, like no sperm. It's usually reversible, although if it's long term, it may not be. But so you have to be really careful, not just anabolic steroid use, but it's not uncommon for some clinicians to prescribe testosterone for guys to boost their energy or their sex drive. But if they are potentially interested in reproduction, we would recommend against that. There are ways to stimulate them to make more of their own testosterone, but be careful about giving testosterone and then using it for bodybuilding purposes. Yeah, could have implications on reproduction later.
And it says, regarding last Q TRT effect on virility. I don't know what it means, but maybe.
Regarding what?
Oh, regarding last question,
Oh.
TRT effect on virility. I think you already answered that. That's TRT is testosterone.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes.
I think that's right.
So yeah, you have to be careful or freeze sperm beforehand.
Yeah. I mean that to me, the science of being able to freeze eggs and freeze sperm and freeze embryos is just that is pretty amazing, and that it works. And they fully functional once you unfreeze them. That's really cool.
Yep, it's amazing. Well, thanks for having me on and being willing
of
to
course,
delve into this topic. And I hope you and your audience found it interesting. And
no, I think everybody found it incredibly interesting. I certainly did. Thanks for the work that you do and for speaking out about this. I think it's really, really important for all of our medical freedoms that we talk about this and then we stand up against kind of when the little tyrants try to control us. So thank you.
Thanks.
Look forward to meeting you in person sometime, maybe in New York. And all right, guys, I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye, Rick. I'll see you guys tomorrow for an AMA Ask Me Anything session at, 2 p.m. East Coast time. So those of you who contribute $25 or more a month should have the link and everything for that. That is not tomorrow. What am I talking about? Today's Thursday. Why? It's not Friday. Tomorrow is a regular news roundup. The time might not be regular. I might be doing it early. People have crammed into my schedule all kinds of stuff in the afternoon. Something has to give here. This is not good. So tomorrow we will have a news roundup. Saturday we will have Ask Me Anything. You can also still ask me anything now if you get in a question quickly. That is, we can talk about anything else that you want. You didn't have a lot of questions on this topic, but you can ask me anything right now. I found this amazing. It's great to have. I love experts. It's great to have an expert who really knows what he's talking about, and somebody who's really experienced in the field that could really dissect it and give you both the practical and the moral issues involved. So that was tremendous of Eric. And I intend, kind of in the future of the show, as I see the future of the show, is to have more people like this on the show. And there are incredible, Ayn Rand fans, objectivists out there who are really world-class experts in the things that they do. And I think one of the things I want to do in the show is do more of highlighting that fact and bringing them forward. Andrew asks, what do I think of Ben Shapiro's opinion? I think it's barbaric. I think it's horrible. And I don't think it's really Ben Shapiro's opinion. I don't know, but Ben Shapiro has proven to me that he is willing to cater to his audience. And therefore, I think he is, even though his Jewish religion might not dictate this, his audience is Christian. He knows that. He knows, now you come up with questions? Jesus, great. Guys, you should have come up with questions earlier. Eric's gone. What was I saying? Yeah, so Ben, Ben, I think is catering to his audience. I don't know what he actually believes. He certainly does with Trump. He doesn't like Trump. He doesn't like anything about Trump. He despises Trump. I think Ben Shapiro deep down cares tremendously about character. For example, the idea of the president of the United States sleeping with porn stars and stuff like that is really offensive to somebody like Ben Shapiro. The many wives he's had, all of this. I mean, Ben Shapiro is really religious, honestly religious, to the extent that he can be, but he can't. He knows where his income comes from. He knows where his income comes from. That's the difference, guys. I will always tell you the truth, or at least I will always tell you what I really think, even if I know it pisses a bunch of you off, even if I know a bunch of you are going to stop supporting the show. I'm going to tell you like it is. I'm going to tell it like I see it. Jay says, why do you prefer Patreon to YBS donations? I'm not exactly sure, but I know that Angela, my assistant, prefers it. She has to deal with it all. I think she just finds it easier to deal with Patreon than PayPal in terms of changing stuff, in terms of adjusting, in terms of canceling people's membership when they want to. It just seems like Patreon's whole business model is built around catering to me, right? To creators, to people who are putting stuff up and to support those creators, and to people like you who want to support creators. So I think what Angela finds, and I'm sure this is true, is that just the better setup for it than PayPal, which is kind of a side business for them. These regular payments, subscriptions. That's not the core of their business. Paulo Zeus says 3D bioprinting and stem cell tech. Yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff coming down the pipe. The question is, will they let us do it? 3D bioprinting sounds like you're playing God there. Stem cells, what the hell? What are you trying to do with these cells? Make them do something God didn't design them to do? Alejandro, can certain genetic diseases be prevented using IVF? Yes, he said that, right? If so, which ones tend to be the most common? He mentioned a couple. He mentioned the one he mentioned is breast cancer, the gene for breast cancer. You can only implant in a woman the embryos that gene is not present. Hutchinson disease, sickle cell anemia, which is just one gene flipped, which you should be able to screen for. But over the next few years, you'll be able to do that with many diseases as we discover more of the links between genes and disease. So it's going to become, there are going to be more options in terms of screening than they have been so far. All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the show. You can use stickers to support the show, to show your appreciation. As just a reminder, the show is made possible through the support of listeners like you. So please consider doing a super sticker, whatever it's called here, or becoming a monthly contributor on Patreon or on yaronbrookshow.com/membership, which is mostly PayPal. All right. Did I say Hutchinson's or Huntington's? I meant Huntington's, right? That's what I meant, I think. All right. As I said, I'll see you tomorrow, probably morning, for a news roundup, and then on Saturday for Ask Me Anything. See you soon. Bye, everybody.